You've been losing arguments your entire life, and it's not because you're wrong. It's because you don't understand the battlefield you're standing on. While you're trying to be logical and reasonable, your opponent is using psychological warfare tactics that would make Niccolò Machiavelli himself proud. Today, I'm going to teach you the verbal combat strategies that the most persuasive people in history have used to dominate every conversation, negotiation, and debate they've ever entered. These aren't just debate tricks. These are weapons of mass persuasion that can transform you from someone who gets steamrolled in arguments to someone who commands respect and wins every verbal battle you choose to fight. The first principle of Machiavellian argumentation is understanding that arguments aren't about truth, they're about power. Most people enter arguments believing that the best logic wins, but that's the thinking of someone who's never studied real persuasion. Machiavelli understood that human beings are not rational creatures. They're emotional creatures who use logic to justify what they already feel. This means that if you want to win an argument, you don't attack their logic first. You attack their emotional foundation. You make them feel uncertain about their position before you even present your counterpoint. The technique is called emotional destabilization. And it works because when someone feels emotionally shaky, they become more susceptible to new information that seems to offer stability. Here's how you execute emotional destabilization without being obvious about it. You start by asking questions that force them to examine the foundation of their belief. Not aggressive questions, but seemingly innocent ones that reveal cracks in their reasoning. For example, if someone argues that their political candidate is the best choice, instead of attacking the candidate directly, you ask something like, "That's interesting. What made you first start supporting them? Was it a specific moment or policy?" This forces them to reconstruct their reasoning on the spot, and most people realize their beliefs are more emotional than logical when they have to explain them out loud. Once they start second-guessing themselves, you've created the opening you need. The beauty of this approach is that your opponent doesn't feel attacked. They feel heard and understood, which makes them more willing to engage with you honestly. But while they're explaining their position, they're also exposing every weakness in their reasoning. You're like a detective who gets the suspect to confess by letting them tell their story. The more they talk, the more they reveal inconsistencies and gaps in their logic. And because they're doing the talking, they can't later claim you are being unfair or manipulative. The second Machiavellian principle is the strategic use of agreement. This sounds counterintuitive, but agreeing with your opponent at the right moments is one of the most powerful weapons in verbal warfare. Machiavelli called this seeming to be what you are not, and in arguments, it means appearing to be on their side while you're actually maneuvering them into a trap. The technique works because humans have a psychological need for consistency. When someone agrees with us, we feel validated, and we're more likely to continue down the same logical path, even if that path leads us into contradicting ourselves. The execution is surgical. You agree with a small part of their arguments, then use that agreement to build toward a conclusion that actually supports your position. Let's say someone argues that the government should increase spending on social programs. Instead of disagreeing immediately, you say, "You're absolutely right that people need help, and it's admirable that you care about those who are struggling. The question is, what's the most effective way to help them?" Now you've established common ground, but you've also shifted the conversation from whether people need help to which method works best. You've moved the battlefield to terrain that favors your argument without them even realizing it. But here's where most people make a critical mistake. They think agreement means being weak or giving ground. That's amateur thinking. Strategic agreement is like a chess grandmaster sacrificing a pawn to set up a checkmate 5 moves later. You're not giving up your position, you're using their momentum against them. Machiavelli understood that the strongest position in any conflict is when your opponent doesn't realize you're their opponent until it's too late. This technique becomes even more powerful when you agree with their values while questioning their methods. People are much more attached to their core values than to specific strategies, so when you validate their values, they feel understood and respected. But once you've established that shared ground, you can guide them toward different methods that achieve the same values. You're not changing their destination, you're just showing them a better route to get there. The third principle is controlling the frame of the argument. Whoever sets the terms of the debate usually wins it, because they've already defined what constitutes victory. Most people let their opponents choose the battlefield, then wonder why they keep losing. Machiavellian arguers understand that before you can win the game, you have to decide what game you're playing. Frame control is about defining not just what you're arguing about, but how you're arguing about it, what evidence counts, and what the stakes are. Here's a practical example of frame control in action. Someone accuses you of being selfish for not wanting to lend them money. The amateur response is to defend yourself by explaining why you're not selfish. But defending puts you in a weak position because you've accepted their frame that selfishness is the issue. The Machiavellian response is to reframe entirely. I'm concerned that lending money might damage our friendship. I've seen too many relationships destroyed by financial arrangements, and I value our relationship too much to risk it. Now, instead of being about your selfishness, the conversation is about protecting the relationship. You've moved from defense to offense without them realizing what happened. Frame control also involves setting the scope of the argument. If someone criticizes one decision you made, don't let them make it about that single decision. Expand the frame. You're focusing on this one instance, but let's look at the pattern of decisions over the past year. Or narrow the frame. We're talking about two completely different issues here. Let's focus on the specific situation at hand. The key is that you decide the scope, not them. Another powerful framing technique is controlling the time horizon. If someone criticizes a decision based on short-term results, you expand the time frame. You're right that the immediate results weren't what we hoped, but let's look at where this positions us for the next 5 years. If they're using long-term projections to justify a bad short-term decision, you narrow the time frame. That might work out eventually, but we need to survive the next 6 months first. You're not changing the facts, you're changing the lens through which those facts are interpreted. The fourth Machiavellian weapon is the strategic use of silence and pacing. Most people are terrified of silence in arguments and rush to fill every pause with words. This is a massive tactical error. Silence is pressure, and pressure creates mistakes. When you make a strong point and then go silent, you force the other person to respond immediately, often before they've had time to think through their response. Hurried responses are weak responses, full of holes you can exploit later. But the real power of silence isn't just the pause after you speak. It's knowing when not to speak at all. Machiavelli wrote about the importance of timing in The Prince, and in arguments, timing means knowing when to let your opponent defeat themselves. Sometimes the best move is to ask one devastating question and then shut up. Let them talk themselves into a corner while you listen for contradictions and weak points you can exploit later. If you're starting to see how these psychological principles can completely change your success in arguments and negotiations, make sure you hit that subscribe button and give this video a like. What I'm sharing here are techniques that took me years to learn and perfect, and I want to make sure you do not miss the advanced strategies I'm going to reveal next. Also, let me know in the comments if you've ever been in a situation where someone used silence against you in an argument. I bet you'll recognize the feeling once you understand what was happening. Pacing is equally important. If your opponent is speaking rapidly and emotionally, you slow down your speech and become more measured. This creates a contrast that makes you appear more rational and in control. If they're speaking slowly and trying to appear thoughtful, you can increase your pace slightly to create urgency and prevent them from overthinking their responses. You're like a boxer who changes rhythm to keep their opponent off balance. The psychological principle behind pacing is called mirroring and contrast. When you want to build rapport, you mirror their pace and energy level. When you want to control the conversation, you use contrast. By deliberately choosing a different pace, you force them to either match your rhythm or feel out of sync with the conversation. Most people unconsciously try to match the pace of the person they're talking to, so when you control the pace, you control their mental state. The fifth principle is the art of strategic concession. This is advanced Machiavellian thinking because it requires you to lose small battles in order to win the war. You deliberately concede points that don't matter while holding firm on the points that do. This serves two purposes. It makes you appear reasonable and open-minded, while simultaneously making your opponent more invested in the areas where you refuse to budge. Here's how it works in practice. Someone is arguing with you about a business decision, and they make 5 different points. 3 of those points are peripheral to what you actually care about, but 2 are central to your position. You concede the 3 peripheral points graciously. You know what? You're right about that. And I hadn't considered that angle. That's a fair point. Now, when you hold firm on the 2 points that matter, your opponent can't easily dismiss you as stubborn or unreasonable. You've established that you're willing to change your mind when presented with good arguments, which makes your refusal to budge on the important points seem more credible. The psychological principle at work here is reciprocity. When you give them something, they feel obligated to give you something in return. By conceding the small points, you create psychological pressure for them to concede something back to you. And since you've only fought hard on the points that really matter to you, you're more likely to get concessions on the things you actually care about. Strategic concession also works because it demonstrates confidence. Someone who is secure in their position can afford to acknowledge when their opponent makes good points. Insecure people feel like they have to defend every detail of their position, which makes them appear weak and desperate. When you concede gracefully, you signal that your core position is so strong that you don't need to defend the periphery. The 6th Machiavellian technique is the use of strategic questions. Questions are more powerful than statements because they force the other person to convince themselves of your point. When you make a statement, they can simply disagree with it. But when you ask the right question, they have to work through the logic themselves, and people are much more likely to believe conclusions they feel they've reached on their own. The key is asking questions that lead them to discover contradictions in their own position. Not gotcha questions that make them feel attacked, but thoughtful questions that genuinely explore their reasoning. Help me understand how that works in practice, or what would have to be true for that to be the best solution. These questions force them to examine their assumptions without feeling like they're under attack. But here's the advanced technique. You chain your questions together so that each answer leads naturally to the next question, and the logical chain leads them to your conclusion. It's like a verbal maze where every path leads where you want them to go. You're not pushing them toward your viewpoint. You're creating a path of discovery that makes your viewpoint seem inevitable. For example, if you want to convince someone that a particular business strategy won't work, you don't attack the strategy directly. Instead, you might ask, what kind of market conditions would need to exist for this strategy to be successful? Then, how do those conditions compare to what we're seeing in the market right now? Then, what would we need to see change before this strategy could work? By the end of this questioning sequence, they've basically argued themselves out of the strategy without you ever attacking it directly. The 7th principle is controlling emotional temperature. Arguments generate heat, and whoever controls that heat controls the argument. Most people either get drawn into emotional escalation, or they try to stay completely cold and logical. Both approaches have weaknesses. If you match their emotional intensity, you lose your strategic thinking ability. If you stay too detached, you can appear cold and lose the human connection that makes persuasion possible. The Machiavellian approach is to be a thermostat, not a thermometer. You don't reflect the emotional temperature of the room, you set it. When they get heated, you can acknowledge their passion while remaining calm. I can see this really matters to you, and I respect that. This validates their emotion without letting it control the conversation. When the conversation gets too cold and logical, you can inject appropriate emotion. This is important because it affects real people's lives. The key insight is that emotions aren't the enemy of good arguments, they're the fuel. People make decisions with their emotions and then justify them with logic. If you can't connect with their emotions, your logic will fall on deaf ears. But if you let their emotions control you, you'll lose your strategic advantage. You have to be emotionally intelligent enough to work with emotions without being controlled by them. Emotional temperature control also involves recognizing when someone is using emotion strategically against you. Some people escalate emotionally, not because they're actually upset, but because they've learned that emotional displays often shut down logical discussion. When you recognize this tactic, you can call it out gently. I want to make sure I understand your concerns clearly. Can you help me understand the specific issues you're worried about? This forces them to move from emotional display back to substantive discussion. The eighth Machiavellian weapon is the strategic use of stories and analogies. Abstract arguments are forgettable, but stories stick in people's minds. When you want to make a point, don't just state it, embed it in a story that makes your point feel inevitable. Stories bypass logical resistance because they feel like entertainment rather than argument. People lower their guard when they think you're just telling a story, but the story is actually a Trojan horse carrying your argument directly into their mind. The most powerful stories are ones where the listener can see themselves in the protagonist. You're not arguing with them directly, you're showing them a character who faced a similar situation and reached the conclusion you want them to reach. I know someone who was in a similar situation, and here's what they learned. Now, you're not telling them they're wrong, you're sharing wisdom from someone else's experience. Analogies work the same way. When someone understands a complex situation through a simple analogy, they feel smart and enlightened. That positive feeling becomes associated with your argument. But you have to choose analogies that truly illuminate rather than just support your position. If your analogy doesn't genuinely help them understand the situation better, it will feel manipulative and backfire. The power of stories in arguments comes from their ability to make abstract concepts concrete. Instead of arguing about principles, you're discussing specific situations with specific outcomes. Instead of debating theories, you're examining evidence. Stories also activate different parts of the brain than logical arguments do. When people hear stories, they imagine themselves in the situation, which creates emotional investment in the outcome. The ninth principle is strategic vulnerability. This might seem counterintuitive in a discussion of verbal warfare, but showing carefully chosen vulnerabilities can be one of your strongest weapons. When you admit to small mistakes or uncertainties, it makes you appear more honest and trustworthy, which increases your credibility when you make strong claims about things you are certain about. The key is choosing your vulnerabilities strategically. You admit uncertainty about things that don't matter to your main argument, while appearing confident about the things that do matter. I might be wrong about the exact numbers, but the overall trend is clear. Or, I don't have all the details on how they implemented it, but I know the results were impressive. This makes you seem honest and reasonable rather than dogmatic, while still maintaining your authority on the points that matter. Strategic vulnerability also creates connection. People trust people who seem human and fallible more than they trust people who seem perfect. When you show a small weakness, it paradoxically makes you appear stronger because it suggests you're secure enough to be honest about your limitations. This technique is particularly powerful when dealing with someone who is trying to portray you as arrogant or overconfident. By acknowledging areas where you're uncertain or where you've made mistakes in the past, you diffuse their attacks while actually strengthening your credibility. It's like a controlled burn that prevents a larger fire. The 10th Machiavellian technique is the art of creating false choices. This is about structuring the argument so that any choice your opponent makes leads them toward your desired outcome. You present them with options that seem different, but actually all support your position, or you frame the discussion so that opposing you requires them to take an extreme position they're not comfortable with. Here's how it works. Instead of arguing directly for your position, you present two options that both move in your direction. We could implement this change gradually over 6 months, or we could do it quickly over 2 months. What do you think works better? Notice that not implementing the change at all isn't presented as an option. You've made the change seem inevitable and moved the discussion to timing and implementation. The false choice can also work by making the alternative to your position seem extreme or unreasonable. Either we address this problem now with reasonable measures, or we wait until it becomes a crisis and have to take drastic action. This makes your position seem like the moderate, sensible choice, even if it was originally seen as radical. The 11th principle is the strategic use of social proof and authority. Humans are social creatures who look to others to determine what's normal and acceptable. When you can show that respected people or successful organizations support your position, you're borrowing their credibility for your argument. But the key is choosing your authorities strategically based on what your opponent respects. If you're arguing with someone who values business success, you cite successful entrepreneurs. If they value academic credentials, you cite researchers and professors. If they value practical experience, you cite people who've actually implemented what you're proposing. The authority you choose should match their values, not yours. Social proof works the same way. Most people in similar situations choose, or the companies that have tried this approach found. These statements make your position seem like the obvious choice rather than a controversial opinion. You're not asking them to trust your judgment. You're showing them that other people they might respect have already made the choice you want them to make. The 12th technique is controlling the pace of revelation. Instead of laying out your entire argument at once, you reveal it piece by piece, getting agreement on each piece before moving to the next. This prevents your opponent from seeing where you're going and formulating counter-arguments. By the time they understand your full position, they've already agreed to most of it. This technique works because of a psychological principle called commitment and consistency. Once people agree to something, they feel pressure to act consistently with that agreement. If you can get them to agree to your premises one by one, they'll feel compelled to accept your conclusion, even if they wouldn't have accepted it initially. The key is making each step seem small and reasonable. Can we agree that customer satisfaction is important? And would you agree that unhappy customers are likely to leave? So we'd want to know if customers are becoming unhappy, right? And if we found out they were unhappy, we'd want to address it quickly. By the end of this sequence, you've gotten them to agree that you need better customer feedback systems, but you never asked them directly to support that conclusion. The 13th principle is the strategic use of time pressure and urgency. When people feel like they need to make a decision quickly, they rely more on emotion and intuition than on careful logical analysis. This can work in your favor if you've done the groundwork to make your position feel emotionally right. But you have to be careful with this technique. If the time pressure feels artificial or manipulative, it will backfire. The urgency has to feel real and reasonable. We need to decide this by Friday because... And then you give a legitimate reason why the deadline matters. The urgency should come from the situation, not from you. Time pressure also prevents overthinking. Some positions fall apart under too much scrutiny, not because they're wrong, but because people can always find something to worry about if they look hard enough. By creating appropriate urgency, you prevent analysis paralysis and help people make decisions based on the most important factors rather than getting lost in minor details. The 14th technique is the strategic use of contrast and comparison. How people evaluate your position depends heavily on what they're comparing it to. If you can control the comparison points, you can make almost any option look good or bad. This is why skilled negotiators often present a high-priced option first to make their real offer seem reasonable by comparison. In arguments, you can use contrast to make your position seem moderate and reasonable. Some people think we should ignore this problem entirely. Others think we need to completely overhaul everything. I think we need a balanced approach that addresses the real issues without creating unnecessary disruption. Now your position seems like the reasonable middle ground, even if it was originally seen as extreme. You can also use contrast to highlight the weaknesses in your opponent's position by comparing it to obviously flawed alternatives. That approach reminds me of what Company X tried, and we all know how that ended. The comparison doesn't have to be perfect, it just has to highlight the aspect of their position that you want people to worry about. Now here's something that might surprise you about everything I've shared so far. These techniques aren't just useful in formal arguments or debates. They work in everyday conversations, business meetings, family discussions, and any situation where you need to influence someone's thinking. If you've been finding this valuable and you want to make sure you never miss strategies like these, hit that subscribe button right now and turn on notifications. I share content like this regularly, and the comment section becomes a goldmine of real-world examples from viewers who apply these techniques. Speaking of which, drop a comment and let me know about a time when someone completely outmaneuvered you in a discussion? What techniques do you think they used? Your examples help me create even more targeted content. The 15th principle is understanding and leveraging cognitive biases. Every human brain has predictable shortcuts and blind spots, and if you understand these patterns, you can structure your arguments to work with them rather than against them. For example, people give more weight to recent information than to older information, so you want to make your strongest points last, not first. The availability heuristic means people judge the likelihood of something based on how easily they can remember examples of it. If you want someone to believe that a particular problem is serious, you don't just cite statistics, you help them remember specific examples. Remember what happened to Johnson's team when they ignored this issue. Now the problem feels more real and immediate because they have a concrete example in their mind. The confirmation bias means people pay more attention to information that supports what they already believe. Instead of fighting this bias, you can use it by showing how your position actually supports values and beliefs they already hold. You're not changing their beliefs, you're showing them that their existing beliefs actually point toward your conclusion. The anchoring bias means people are heavily influenced by the first piece of information they receive about a topic. This is why it's crucial to establish your frame early in any argument. The first way the issue gets defined will influence how people think about it throughout the entire discussion. The 16th technique is the strategic use of specificity and vagueness. Specific details make arguments feel more credible and concrete, while vagueness allows people to fill in the blanks in ways that support your position. The key is knowing when to use each approach. When you want to establish credibility and make something feel real, you use specific details. Instead of saying, "This approach has been successful," you say, "This approach increased efficiency by 23% in the first quarter and reduced costs by $150,000 over 6 months. The specificity makes it feel like you know what you're talking about and have real evidence for your claims. But when you're describing potential problems with your opponent's approach, strategic vagueness can be more powerful. "I'm concerned about the unintended consequences of that approach" is often more effective than listing specific problems, because it allows them to imagine their own worst-case scenarios. Their imagination will often come up with scarier possibilities than anything you could specify. The 17th principle is the power of reframing failure and success. How people interpret outcomes depends heavily on the frame you put around them. A 60% success rate can sound either impressive or disappointing depending on how you present it. "We succeeded with 60% of cases" sounds different from "we failed with 40% of cases," even though they're describing the same outcome. You can reframe your opponent's successes as partial failures and your failures as learning experiences or near successes. "Yes, that project was completed, but it was 3 months late and 50% over budget. That's not the kind of success we can afford to repeat." Or, "That pilot project didn't achieve all its goals, but it gave us valuable insights that have informed our current approach." The key is that reframing has to feel fair and reasonable. If your reframing feels like obvious spin, it will backfire. The best reframes reveal a truth that was always there but wasn't being emphasized. The 18th technique is strategic repetition and variation. Important points need to be repeated, but if you repeat them exactly the same way, people will tune out. The solution is to make the same point in different ways throughout the argument. You might make it as a logical argument first, then as a story, then as a question, then as a comparison. Each repetition reinforces the point while feeling fresh and interesting. By the end of the discussion, your main points will feel familiar and well supported, while your opponent's points will feel like they were only mentioned briefly. But repetition has to feel natural, not forced. You can't just say the same thing 3 times in a row. You weave your key points throughout the conversation so that they keep coming up organically as part of different aspects of the discussion. The 19th principle is the strategic use of momentum and timing. Arguments have rhythms and natural breaking points, and skilled arguers know how to use these patterns to their advantage. When you're winning, you want to keep the pressure on and not give your opponent time to regroup. When you're losing, You want to slow things down and change the subject. You can create momentum by stringing together several small wins before going for a larger point. Each agreement builds on the previous one until your opponent finds themselves agreeing to things they might have rejected if you'd asked directly. So we agree the current system isn't working perfectly, and we agree that customers are complaining more than they used to, and we agree that fixing this should be a priority. Given all that, don't you think we should at least pilot the new approach? Timing also means knowing when to end the argument. The goal isn't to keep arguing until your opponent surrenders, it's to reach a conclusion that serves your objectives. Sometimes that means ending while you're ahead. Sometimes it means leaving certain points unresolved so you can return to them later with fresh perspectives. The 20th and final principle is understanding that the ultimate goal of Machiavellian argumentation isn't destruction, it's construction. You're not trying to humiliate your opponent or prove that you're smarter than they are. You're trying to create better outcomes for everyone involved. The most skilled verbal warriors know that today's opponent might be tomorrow's ally, so you win in a way that preserves relationships and opens doors for future collaboration. This means giving your opponent ways to save face when they change their position. Instead of forcing them to admit they were completely wrong, you can frame their change as a natural evolution based on new information. I think we've both learned things from this discussion that we didn't know when we started. Given what we now understand, what do you think makes the most sense going forward? The ultimate Machiavellian insight is that winning arguments isn't about being right, it's about being effective. The goal isn't to crush your opponent, it's to achieve your objective. Sometimes that means helping your opponent save face while still getting what you want. Sometimes it means ending the argument without a clear winner, but with your position strengthened. The master of verbal warfare knows when to press their advantage and when to offer an honorable exit. These 20 principles form a complete system for verbal dominance, but like any powerful tool, they come with responsibility. The techniques I've shared can be used to manipulate and deceive, but they're most powerful when used to find better solutions and create better outcomes for everyone involved. The best arguments are ones where both people learn something and the best solution emerges, even if it wasn't what either person originally had in mind. The person who masters these Machiavellian principles doesn't just win arguments, they elevate the level of discourse around them. They make conversations more productive, decisions more thoughtful, and relationships stronger. That's the true art of verbal warfare, not destroying your opponent, but making everyone stronger through the process of intellectual combat. When you can do that consistently, people will seek out your opinion, respect your judgment, and trust your leadership, because they know that engaging with you intellectually will make them better thinkers and better decision makers. That's power that goes far beyond winning any single argument. That's the power to shape the world around you through the force of your ideas and the skill of your presentation.